Hi everybody, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to today's event, Translating China in the Changing Political Economy, 1920s to 2020s. My name is Julia Ng. I'm a reader in critical theory at Goldsmith, and I'm the organizer of today's symposium. Just before we begin, I just want to let you know that this event is hopefully going to be recorded, but all the microphones are geared towards this side of the room, so obviously there are seats over there and the thing is protected there, but if any of you over there have questions, please speak up. And I would like to ask the speakers to then repeat the question for the sake of our mysterious microphones somewhere up there. Anyway, where was I? So before we then begin, once again, I want to thank first Royal Holloway Center for Continental Philosophy and Department of Politics, International Relations, and Philosophy, and especially Professor Nathan Witter, who's sitting right up here, for generously providing us with the room we're in right now. I also obviously want to thank the British Academy and its mid-career fellowship program for supporting my project, the broader research project, of which today is the first of 3 public conferences. So as a way of introducing today's discussion, I just want to briefly present this overall project. If the slides will let me. If. It was working before. Sorry, 1 second. I can chat a little bit. Oh,
whoa!
How did you do that?
I just moved the mouse to the right side.
This is why Nathan is here. Very helpful. Thank you. So the bigger project is entitled Taoism and Capitalism. And it was inspired by a conference I organized in 2015 in which Professor Li Zhenko, sitting right here, who's also one of our speakers today, also participated. The paper I gave then, which I've also since published in Theory, Culture, and Society, centered around a critical altercation that had gone entirely unnoticed. Namely, one in which Walter Benjamin redefines capitalism as a religion, as a rejoinder to Max Weber, though not to his Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, but to its sequel, Confucianism and Taoism, in which Weber argues that these, capitalism and Taoism, are states of irrationality, which, unlike Calvinism in Europe, will never give rise to an indigenous capitalism. For Weber, the religious condition in China lacked the despair that might inspire a creative impulse to dominate over nature and transform the world. In it, therefore, any action is therefore non-productive, non-competitive, and lies outside of the time of capital, a situation that Weber interprets as a structural underpinning of political economy, on the basis of which he then distinguishes between European and non-European ideal types. For Weber, who ignores the instances of ethical rationality evidenced by centuries of millenarian movements associated with Taoist sects, the non-productive individual without a vocation simply falls outside of history. For Benjamin, though, capitalism itself has the features of religion. That's this line over here, in case you're interested. And so might take root anywhere that its essence might be found. And as this is merely wherever one incurs a debt, takes blame, and thereby enters into the moral sphere of guilt, the history of capitalism thus only happens to look like Christianity in Europe, as demonstrated for Benjamin by the fact that non-productive individuals are evidently drawn into capitalism's fate as well. And from this, Benjamin draws a conclusion that would issue into one of the primary insights of the early Frankfurt School. The mythic structures that underpin political economy do not therefore distinguish between European and non-European ideal types, but themselves contain and make legible epoch-ending social historical transformations. But what's striking, though, is that Benjamin was preoccupied with Taoism beyond this one fragment from 1921. From his earliest writings on youth to his essays on Kafka and the artwork in the Age of Mechanical Reproducibility in the 1930s, Benjamin repeatedly turned to concepts of non-action that he attributed to Taoism. And the second striking thing is that the image of Taoism that emerges from Benjamin is associated with a mode of political economic activity that, as activity, isn't reducible then to the passivity, quietism, or ineffectual magic typically associated with Taoism in merely Orientalist reception. Moreover, there was a pattern of treating Taoist themes as seeds of a critical social theory amongst thinkers in Benjamin's milieu, including Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, Kafka, Brecht, Ernst Bloch, and also Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. As you see in this slide, for instance, they also cross-referenced each other. Martin Buber's translation of the Zhuangzi from 1910, for instance, partly inspires Rosenzweig's discussion of the Tao and the Star of Redemption, on which then in turn Benjamin comments in his Kafka essay. My project, therefore, fleshes out this constellation to articulate a theory of non-actions that fall by the wayside of European moral political consideration, and yet for this very reason render legible capital critical modes of being and acting in the world. And what's more, these are pictures of non-action that, while retrieved from classical texts, also register the contemporaneity of China circa 1900, while in the throes of epical, economic, and political transformation resulting from its untimely collision with modern industrial European market forces and colonial imperial conditions of knowledge, a situation one might call a, quote, simultaneity of the non-simultaneous. Ernst Bloch is the one who first coined that phrase to describe modernity as an imbalance in which social milieus that fall outside of the classical Marxian categories of property owners and wage laborers, so for instance, small-scale farmers and tradespeople that were characteristic of China's economy well into the 1920s, were nevertheless intertwined with capital. And following on this, one could say, therefore, that there existed a plurality of Taoisms registering the non-unilinearity of China's modernization in intelligible ways. This brings me to today's topic, the importance of translation broadly understood for the articulation and critique of political economies. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, ideas were transmitted from semi-colonial China through translations of Taoist classics dating back to 400 BCE, of literary works from the Tang, Ming, and Qing dynasties, as well as contemporary social political analyses. Their intermediaries range from missionaries turned sinologists and sinologists to anarchist geographers and ghost translators. This transmission of ideas coincided with the history of Christian missionary incursions, Western trade interests, and eventually British and German colonial enterprises at strategic ports on the coast of China from which they, and then eventually America and Japan, sought to open up China's interior to capitalist exploitation. Translations, no doubt, were an extractivist project that participated in these exploitations, but also, therefore, recorded wayward acts of meaning-making, anomalous activity, and unexpected industry. In a word, agency. And in a few minutes, we will be hearing more about this from Professor Timothy Barrett, sitting right here, with respect to Dao De Jing translations into the English and their institutional contexts. In the German context, which is what I'm focused on, the practice of translation was nurtured at the Seminar for Oriental Languages, which was founded in 1887 with the express purpose of supporting the German Empire's nascent colonial interests in the Kaohsiung Bay area in the northeast. The first languages that it's on its syllabus were Chinese and Manchurian. The grammar was supplemented with practical tutelage in surveying, colonial administration, and applied chemistry, specifically beer brewing, because Germans. I'm not joking. Found this in the archives. Teaching the languages were, moreover, young Chinese lecturers who were signed on 3 to 5 year contracts. At least 2 of these used their positions to fund their doctoral studies, Wang Tingdao and Chang Wu, who both completed theses on topics relating to political philosophy and economy. Wang, moreover, met Martin Buber and eventually ghost translated significant parts of his version of the Zhuangzi, as well as his selection of Pu Songling's Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio. Chang, for his part, sent a dedicated copy of a self-published translation of 105 Chinese stories to Franz Rosenzweig in gratitude for a kindness that had been rendered. Now, my point is that the SOS, the Seminar for Orientalische Sprachen, which soon established itself as the center of German Oriental research, and also was consulted when the creation of SOAS here was first proposed, instituted the learning of languages as a modern endeavor, with practical, economy-oriented implications, and that this was a major source of China's image and its literary and philosophical heritage for the figures in question. The other major source was Richard Wilhelm, who arrived in Kaohsiung Bay as part of the Protestant mission shortly before the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, but whose sympathies increasingly aligned with indigenous anti-colonial sentiment. His immensely popular translations of the Tao Te Ching and other classics were begun during his time in Qingdao, where he also criticized Europe's exploitation of China through its railroad construction and law of extraterritoriality. His translation of Lao Tzu here was intensely promoted within the German youth movement in the 1910s and found its way into the bookshelves, letters, and diary entries of Benjamin, Kafka, and Buber, thanks to the school reformer Gustav Wyneken, one of the leaders of this youth movement, who translated his own interest in Taoism into a program of social change. Now, Wilhelm can hardly be aligned with Marxian thought, and his emphasis on interculturality led to undue influence of Goethe's language on the Tao Te Ching's terminology. So, for instance, if you see here, Tao is translated as Zin here, meaning or direction associated with the course of Leben, or life, which here translates De. Reference to a letter Goethe wrote on Leben, Sinn des Lebens. Anyway. In his Wilhelm's paratextual commentary on Confucius's Analects, he redescribes Confucianism as a, quote, criticism projected temporally backwards, and a theory of a bureaucratic state underpinning absolute monarchy, and reimagines Chinese optimism, i.e. the Taoism-aligned lack of despair, as a belief in the power of ideals that are situated on, quote, the shadow side of the Chinese idea of state. And when in 1925, Wilhelm founded the China Institute in Frankfurt, which was 2 years after the establishment of the Institute for Social Research that would later become known as the Frankfurt School, Wilhelm became not only the head of the second most important center for China studies in Germany after Berlin, but also the conduit for visiting Chinese intellectuals who were active in the revolutionary movements of the mid-20s. Wilhelm also argued for Taoism's relevance in comprehending the impact of regional difference and terrain on social thought. Wilhelm's final book, Chinese Economic Psychology, illustrates this in its discussion of ancestor worship, which had been an object of xenophobic fascination as the apparent indicator of a realm that was mummified in its own superstitions. It's a quote from Herder, anyone's Germanist here. Wilhelm, by contrast, notes that graves, while slowly eating up the arable land, also rendered hillsides useless for reforestation and therefore useless for the building of railways that was part of the German and British ambition to modernize by penetrating into the heartland. Thus, Wilhelm writes, ancestor worship is also an instance of a, quote, playful formation concerning the proposer. Key here is the idea that terrain impacts regional differences in social thought, a thesis that was famously elaborated by Wilhelm's doctoral student, Karl August Wittfogel, a member of the early Frankfurt School. Also a prominent figure in the German youth movement who owned a highlighted copy of Wilhelm's Tao Te Ching, Wittfogel reacted to the May 30th movement by laying out his first book, Awakening China, Das Erwachende China, the link between European imperialism and the revolt of China's peasantry against the state's resultant intensification of the internal tariff. He also outlines for the first time how China's state bureaucracy developed from the need to manage large-scale river movements with irrigation works and a new taxation system, which was a revival of Marx and Engels' idea of an Asiatic mode of production as a phase separate from European feudalism. Central to his doctoral thesis on China's economy and society, this emphasis on the spatial context of the antagonisms pertinent to work prepared the way to his later thesis on the multilinearity of global development. One significant source for Awakening China, though, was Bertrand Russell's The Problem of China, from whose 1925 German translation, Wittfogel draws facts concerning the student and workers' movements. Now, I won't say more about this, as we will be hearing shortly about Russell's visit to China from Dr. Jan Vorowski, who's sitting back there. But I do want to mention that Russell, who also ruminates on the utility of the non-utility of trees that are planted around graves vis-a-vis railway construction, incorporates passages that he deems key from translations of the Zhuangzi and Tao Te Ching by James Legge and Lionel Giles, including a parable that Giles names the non-interference of nature, which is more commonly known as the horse's hoofs, and also, you can't really see this as I was in German, this from Legge's Zhuangzi, which Russell takes as his book's motto. The anecdote describes how heedless and sudden allegories for Western imperial industrialism destroyed the very chaos that allowed them to thrive. It also corresponds with the line that Russell cites from paragraph 51 of Giles's Tao Te Ching, which he had already taken as the model to an earlier work, Roads to Freedom. The line reads, production without possession, action without self-assertion, development without domination, with the word production here being Giles's translation of sheng, or letting grow. In Russell's citation of this translation alone, then, one discerns how a loose translation becomes an intentional transformation of the meaning of production in English and its eventual German translation. Production that, heeding a tree's proper sphere of development, leads to just ends without political imposition or exploitation. This brings me finally to today's symposium, which is devoted to the exploration of the British context that provides a recurrent and important subtext for my own project. And I'm very grateful that Professor Timothy Barrett, Dr. Jan Vorowski, and Professor Li Zhenko have graciously accepted my invitation to collectively paint a picture of how China has been communicated in the context of political economic change, which would normally be inconspicuous given the disciplinary divisions that normally separate us. So how it will proceed is I will introduce each of them separately before the presentations, after which there's going to be a roundtable. And there's going to be time for questions throughout. And for those of you who came in a bit late, there's mics recording, but they're all based in this side of the room. So if you have a question over there, please speak louder. And then I'm going to ask the speakers to repeat your question if it's not. Now, last but not least, you will hopefully have received with your registration email a link, but we've put together a program booklet for you with excerpts that we invited you to consider before today. If you'd like to access this right now, scan this QR code. It's also posted on these, it's all around the room, these big QR codes, that's the same thing.